with this particular talk is more of a cultural travel talk, so it's going to be a little different from some of the previous formats, which were more of a biography or history talks. And we're going to talk about some of the history and some of the places and significance of that, some of the culinary, which is always a lot of fun, some of the old synagogues. And then when we get to the Q&A, we'll invite you to ask questions. Judy will facilitate. You're also welcome to share an anecdote, a very, succinctly and relevant that if you want to. Sometimes audience members enjoy that. And as I said, this is based on my book here. It is a bestseller for the publisher, I'm happy to say. And you can, contact us if you want a signed copy. You can get it at, of course, Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, and it's in a lot of stores all around the country, bookstores too. So definitely pick up a copy. Okay. So with that said, let's see if I can get in here. Go to the next slide. Okay. So let's get into it. What are we going to talk about today? I'm going to give an intro, which we did, talk a brief history of Jews in New York City, because this particular presentation is focused on Jewish history and culture. A spotlight on notable personages. So here's where we'll talk a little bit about it, just a few, Jewish personages in NYC history and why they're important. And some of them I do full talks on that we could do, and we'll get into much more depth. Travel, places, and food. Okay, so we covered all that. All right, next. So let's talk a little bit about the brief history of Jews in New York. So this is where you can put in the chat, in 1654, where were the first Jews in New York from? Why don't you put it in the chat and maybe Judy can facilitate and let us know what people are putting in.
Anybody want to put anything in chat? Okay.
Like what country did they come from?
I don't see any guesses.
You can guess. You could be wrong. Just don't worry.
Brazil. James. Well, there's a Daddy Bert wrote Israel with a question mark.
No, there was
Bill
no
from
Israel. Yeah.
James. George writes Spain. I'll say the Netherlands for the hell of it.
Okay. So you're all wrong except for I think one person. Yeah. So remember, Israel is just from 1948, so it wouldn't be that. The answer is Brazil. So this is one of the misconceptions. Like the earliest Jews that came, of course, to New Amsterdam, obviously in 1654, were from Brazil, Recife, Brazil, which is in the northern part of the country. And if So they were on like the Jewish Mayflower, as they call it, in May 1654 from Recife. They were 23 Marranos who were fleeing persecution. So when we look at some of the history of it, the Spanish and Portuguese ruled Brazil, as you know, and it kind of alternated between Spanish and Portuguese, and they were pretty strict about worshiping and what you were allowed to do and weren't. So a lot of Jews had to worship underground or convert. It was a little bit like it was for their ancestors during the 1490s in Spain with the Spanish Inquisition. So, like George, you mentioned Spain. I mean, their ancestors may have in the 15th century. Then, they came to Brazil and then were under Spanish and Portuguese rule. But then the Dutch conquered northern Brazil in 1624, and this allowed for the first public Jewish community. So the Dutch were more business minded. They were less, and everyone, please make sure to mute yourself. Very important, everyone mute themselves. So the Dutch conquered northern Brazil, and they were basically fine with some of this, open display of religion. And it made the population like, oh, we kind of want a life where we can practice more in the open. But then Portugal recaptured northern Brazil in 1654, and they basically gave an ultimatum. They said, you either have to renounce your Jewish practices or leave the country in 3 months. And I think the Jewish practices varied from more religious to less religious, but even so, these 23 decided they want a different life. And so there's different theories about how this happened, and in the book I have a whole intro about it. But suffice it to say that these 23 men, women, and children, they were going to sail to little known New Amsterdam. It was a fledgling, um, colony of the Dutch, of the Dutch West India Company. It was not that successful business wise. And what happened is their boat was seized by the Spanish and the French and also by pirates. And for an unknown reason, they then agreed to go to New Amsterdam. I think initially they were planning to go to the Netherlands because you wouldn't really think about going to New Amsterdam for something like that, but they end up there by fate. The only problem is they don't have enough money to pay for the trip. So they agree to be responsible collectively for the debt because the shipper demands payment. And Governor Peter Stuyvesant turns them away. So he's living in Lower Manhattan. If you go to Lower Manhattan right now, right where Staten Island Ferry is, you'll see a sign about exactly this, and like the earliest 23. And they have a celebration, I think, every year, which you could look into if you're interested. Um, so it was the colony who was living here. They did have slaves, and so slaves lived here too in a different quarter, but they were part of the life here too. Because I think many of you know that slavery would last even when it became New York, all the way to 1827 in New York, as it was in many northern states. So Governor Peter Stuyvesant turns them away. Too bad that you sailed here and you had to sell all your possessions for paying for it. I cannot allow you to stay here, because I'm running this colony, and I just don't. You're going to be a burden to me. So what the 23 Jews do is, or their leaders, is they appeal this decision to the Dutch West India Company, and they basically say, like, we've been really good, customers of yours and business partners, and we're not going to be a burden. So there's really no reason to not accept us here. The Dutch West India does take up this appeal, and they issue this decision. These people may travel and trade to and in New Amsterdam and live and remain there, provided the poor among them shall not become a burden to the company, which is referring to the Dutch West India Company, or to the community, but be supported by their own nation. And I think you'll find one thing that Jews are very good at is developing communities and infrastructure which we'll talk about later when we get to the 19th century and all of that. But, a lot of charitable groups to help other Jews who come over, like finding jobs and housing, a lot of like with healthcare and hospitals. They're very, very good at that. Now, why? One reason might be because, look at how they started here and what they had to do. So then I'm just, I want to just like let you know, to set the lay of the land. We're going to go very quickly through the history because I'm gonna, a lot of this talk is about the cultural travel, but in the book we go much deeper. Okay. So in the 1700s, so in 1664, the British take over the island. A lot of you know that. So it goes from New Amsterdam to New York. Now, what happens to these 23? Like, we don't know exactly, but I can tell you that within 10 years, most of the original 23 leave, probably due to poor business environment. I interviewed some historians, by the way. That's their speculation. And also a lack of civil rights, you know? So can we know exactly what happened to all 23? No. But we know that a lot of them did stay, but some did. We'll talk about that later, or here about Asser Levy. The Caribbean was very prosperous at the time, and it was, a lot of sugar and rum, and some probably went to the Caribbean, if we were to take a guess. Now, in the mid 1600s, Asser Levy and his wife Miriam, they stayed and they kind of became prominent citizens. Um, so you also have now we're talking about in 1730. So, okay, the Jews practice underground. They practice their services, their daily services, Shabbat services, holidays, right? Like Rosh Hashanah is coming up tomorrow as an example. They would do that in people's houses. It was underground. Now, um, they the British were a little more, they were kind of a little more okay with it. So you start to see a little bit more out in the open. And then eventually you have your first building in 1730, which is Sharif, Israel. And that's on Mill Street. So if you go to Mill Street today in downtown in the financial district, you'll see that. I mean, you'll see the area. It's a parking garage, but you can see like where it was. It's not far from William and Wall Street. So in 1700s, Jews were only about 300 out of a population of 13,500. And this was all about being loyal to the British or not, or wanting to break away as to have your own colony or your own country. And the Jews were both. Some were pro-slavery, some were anti-slavery. Some were abolitionists. Some were loyal to the crown, some were not. Now, after the colonists win the war, George Washington, who gave his farewell address in Francis's Tavern. Francis's Tavern is the oldest continuous tavern in America, and it's a beautiful place to visit. It's very well kept. You can go. Great travel tip for you. It's right in downtown Manhattan. It has a tavern, and it also has a museum on the top floor about the Revolution and other things. Now, it was there that George Washington said goodbye to his troops and thanked them in 1783, having no idea that he'd be president 6 years later. And he, very relevant for this, our topic today, he basically proclaimed rights for the Jews when in his speeches and what he had in mind. Now let's kind of dive into the 1800s. So here we have, I was mentioning before, divided slavery, which was banned in New York in 1827, but schools and theaters did remain segregated. Some Jews were pro-slavery. I think that was a lot of biblical justification, just like that was quite common in evangelical and Protestant Christian circles, and very much around economic interests. Others, however, condemned it, and some were a big part of the abolitionist movement. So there's not one answer. It's nuanced. Now, if we go to the 1830s and 1850s, we start having the German Jewish immigration downtown, but moving uptown and settling in like more of a middle class, which was sort of this new milieu that was arising. And you start to have like, these household names that you all know arise during this period. So there's someone in the waiting room. Yeah. In 1880s, you also have the influx of Eastern Europe and Russian Jews. They tended to be a very different class. They were often impoverished. They spoke little English. Many spoke Yiddish. I mean, they might have spoken different languages, perhaps German, Eastern European, Slavic languages, depending on where they came from, and Yiddish. But that wasn't valued, even though they could speak that or perhaps read some different literatures. Um, and then the Lower East Side would become the most densely packed in the world. I mean, just think about that. We only like take a moment. Like in the 1700s, it was agriculture, it was farmland. Then in the early and mid 1800s, it was a little more sort of well-to-do German. But then all of a sudden, you have, this huge influx of immigrants. It was pretty easy to get in here too. If you were reasonably healthy and you didn't say that you were a communist or anarchist and a few other things, you probably had a pretty good chance of getting in here through Ellis Island. I mean, I know some were sent back, but you had though a real, a lot of sociologists talk about a tipping, like a reversal of the social scale, because some immigrants were very scholarly in their homelands. Maybe they were rabbis, or maybe they were scholars, or maybe they were just skilled in different things. Unfortunately, when they moved here, it was not marketable. And so a lot of them kind of went from towards the upper part of the social ladder to the lower part, and vice versa. Those that were some of in the lower part in Eastern Europe, who were sort of these scrappy like vendors and merchants, they did well here because that's kind of what was called for. So you had a lot of sweatshops. A lot of these jobs were also very dangerous. Um, I do another talk on New York in the Progressive Era, 1890 to 1920, and we go into a lot more about this and what the labor rights were like or not like, and you've got the rise of unions and strikes and so on. But it was very tough living, and you have, but at the same time, you had amazing culture that came from it, whether it was from the Educational Alliance, whether it was about some of the amazing literature. You had a lot of the Yiddish theater, which we'll talk about later, which came, well, it came from Romania and Eastern Europe, but it started to really flourish here, although some of it was not very good. And so you also have like this quote that I have from Abraham Kahan. Now he was a novelist. I recommend his novels to you, but also he started the Forward, the newspaper, which is actually still around, and that was in Yiddish and English. So he wrote, "As a seething human sea, fed by streams, rivulets of rills of immigration fleeing from all the Yiddish-speaking centers in Europe," and that's from A Tale of the New York Ghetto. So just thought I'd put in something kind of personal because, I wanted to make this sort of like multi-textured, this talk. So my great grandmother was Ida Cohen, and she married my great grandfather, Joseph Goldstein, right in the exact area we're talking about, exact area. That's why I put it in this talk on Henry Street. So I thought this would be interesting for you. You see, like we got this from the municipal archives. You have the date, you have who they are. You see they came from Russia, and then 83 Henry Street. And we're going to talk about the Henry Street a little later in the talk. Just 21, you know, and all of that. And her father was Solomon Cohen. Um, and so, and they got married right here. So it's sort of interesting how all this kind of connects. Okay. So basically, there's so much to say about this topic, and I talk about it more in some other talks. But let's go. Like I said, we're sort of going quickly. So like the 1920s to 50s. So I think a lot of you know that there was the Immigration Act of 1924, right? And this dramatically slowed immigration, and it basically imposed certain quotas. So it all of a sudden became extremely hard to get in here. And what happened was that the population did start to decrease, and you also have the Great Depression of 1930s. Um, so because of the hard economic times, you do see a lot more a rise in anti-Semitism, and you have the onset of World War II and its devastating impact, and kind of a closing of the doors to welcoming others, even if they're victims in their own lands of various things. Another trend we see here is the divide over, especially Orthodox and Reform, which came from Germany in large part, and then the conservative movement, which is a reaction to the Reform, saying this has gone too far. We want to put back, some of the tradition. Communism and socialism were much more popular too during this period, and some Jews were about that. Especially looking at a lot of the terrible labor conditions and the economic inequality and the depression. They would say like, why should we go with the current system? What's that doing for us? You also have the trend of Zionism and this notion of having a homeland for the Jews and land for the Jews, which would finally materialize, of course, in 1948. Um, Now, after the war, you with the immigration, you have so you have baby boomers, the baby boom, um, who were born after 1945. They're referred to today as the baby boomers, of course, and you have a big in the 60s, like going to leaving the city for the suburbs and the whole like suburbanization and housing there. more of an emphasis on the family unit. But that in the late 60s, I would say the mid to late 60s, not the early 60s, mid to late, the Jewish population in NYC declines, and you start to have a lot of urban decay because there's also a lot less money because you have less tax base since a lot of the residents with good incomes are leaving the city. And so it's hard to have as many social services. You have urban decay. Um, then in the 80s, you have another theme. And, in this Jewish New York, we also think about northern Manhattan, like near Inwood. So that's where a lot of Soviet Jews went. In the 80s, you have some Jews who were able to leave Russia and they came here for a different life. And some settled. Like when I went to that area and learned about some of the different community places and synagogues, I definitely found that a lot settled in that area. So here's a quote. The role of an artist is to make a neighborhood so desirable that the artist can no longer afford to live there. It's kind of funny. Anyone have any idea who said that? It's a very famous New York City personage. Right in the chat. You can take a guess. I'll give you a hint. It's someone who was known for making very like funny comments and he had a lot of like well, okay, I'll give some of it away. He's a
Was it
politician.
Jules Pfeiffer?
What?
Was it Jules Pfeiffer?
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's a politician, and he was known for being kind of funny. He was a real character. Any guesses? It's fine.
Barbara, go ahead. You can unmute or write to me in chat.
Okay. Yeah, how about Ed Koch?
All right.
It would be
I
something.
couldn't hear her answer. Can you repeat
Excellent
it?
job. You got Judy's gonna give you a little prize after the talk. No, I'm just
Okay,
kidding. Great
that's
job.
all.
I'm
Can
kidding
you
about the
repeat
prize.
that? Paul, we couldn't hear the
Ed
answer.
Koch, Mayor Ed Koch.
Ed Koch,
Yeah.
right.
So yeah, no, good job. But there's no prize. Okay.
I just want to add one little thing. You see the graffiti there. We're having a talk about graffiti tomorrow. So I hope you'll come back for that in the morning. Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
interesting.
Yep.
And so in the mid 90s, 2000s, then it sort of turned around with the gentrification and the reinvigoration of neighborhoods. So for our talk today, it's important because some of what we're going to talk about is around that theme. We're going to look at some synagogues that have done that and tried to preserve themselves, some of the eateries, and some of these eateries survived. Listen, you have to give them a lot of credit. They've survived for 150 years through thick and through thin, and they're still there. So we'll talk about all that. Okay, now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about some notable personages. Um, let's talk a little bit about Emma Lazarus. So she was, you see, like the daughter of an affluent sugar refiner. I mentioned the Jewish settlers to New Amsterdam in the beginning of the talk. She was a descendant, if not one of the 23, pretty much around that time. So some of them did settle here. She was very inspired by poetry. I think it's fair to say that her mentor was Ralph Waldo Emerson. They were friends. He really guided her. She was very much about listening to the whisper of the voice within. That's very transcendental. That's very 19th century. She published several books and wrote, some of them were self-published, by the way. Her father did that for her, and wrote for Popular Century magazine. And she attended the protest rally on Russian Jews and their plight. So, all right, here's the deal. She came from this well-to-do family, and she was a poet. Great for her. And she was writing poetry and great. Well, not so fast. She had a real like awakening in life, which was like I always try to look at what are different points of inspiration or make someone look at things very differently and shift some of their focus and work and mission. So she went to a protest rally on Russian Jews' plight, and she visited the new immigrants on Ward's Island, and she saw the appalling conditions that they lived in, and it made her much more politically minded. So she became an ardent reformer and Zionist. Just writing the poetry wasn't enough for her. It's enough for a lot of other poets. That's fine, but for her it wasn't. So and she kind of came up with this quote, which is you hear it all the time in all kinds of movements. Until we are free, none of us are free. I think she originated that. So she was asked to write a poem for an auction to fund a base for the Liberty statue. That's what it was called, the Liberty statue. Now, the Liberty statue was from France and it was more celebrating liberty. It wasn't really about all this immigrant stuff. It was more about the virtue of liberty as a political ideal. Now, she thought, how am I going to write this poem? And she decided to compare it to the Colossus of Rhodes. So a Greek statue, yet that was, in Rhodes, that was all about in 280 BC, that was honoring the sun god. Um, and it was very much like this tough figure, right? About keeping someone out. Now that statue was destroyed in an earthquake, but she reimagined it, you can say. And she thought, let's reimagine it to be about letting immigrants in. So that's why it's called the New Colossus. She felt the Liberty statue welcomed outsiders. See, so that's when it really became the Statue of Liberty as we think of it. It did not really start out that way. Now, in 1883, mounted at the Statue of Liberty in 1903, the New Colossus. So she also, a lot of people were not famous in their time, as you know, and she wasn't because her poem. I mean, okay, she wrote this poem. It was an auction. She raised money for it, but I wouldn't say she was famous. She really became famous. She died at a young age, at 38. So she died in 1887, and she never saw her poem inscribed. Um, and little did she know that some of her followers would get it mounted on the statue, and that it would really inspire people all around the world. Like when immigrants would come here, that's the first thing they would see, and they would all rush to that part of the boat and look at it and feel so uplifted from looking at it after their arduous journey across the ocean. It really changed the way people saw, in some ways, the way that poetry can do or statues can do. It changed the way that they saw things. Um, it's also interesting about, like, when I did the Penn Station talk, you might remember I talked about Alexander Cassatt, and he came up with this whole notion of having the most beautiful station in the world. And he oversaw that and took great risks with it, but he died before he knew it would be what it would become. Same here. But it's like an interesting theme. Like sometimes someone in their lifetime doesn't get to know what their impact will be. So anyway, there's a memorial plaque downtown about some of this. And of course you can obviously visit, you all know, the Statue of Liberty Island, Ellis Island. Um, then I have something in case some of you missed the talk I did on Lillian Wald. We won't spend too much time in case you saw that talk, but let me say that, she was a middle-class German Jewish nurse from Rochester, New York, and studied at the New York Hospital. She was disenchanted with nursing. And her, I was talking about that with Emma Lazarus. The big moment for Lillian Wald, I would say, is when she was teaching a hygiene class and a young girl approached her in the middle of the class, came in from the street and asked her to follow her, taking her through winding passageways to help her dying mother. And she realizes that she wants to dedicate her life's work to helping the poor. And she moves into the community with her roommate, Mary Brewster, and starts the Lower East Side, starts what would become the Henry Street settlement, actually living there, and the beginning of like public health. I think because this is a Jewish talk, that's why I'm going to mention about she received philanthropic support from Jacob Schiff, the mother-in-law. Okay, so Jacob Schiff was a very well-to-do investment banker, and he really believed in tikkun olam, which means repair of the world. And you're supposed to give a certain percentage of your salary to charity. And he did that, like 10%. He really believed in that, and he did. So part of what he gave to was the Henry Street settlement and for, a lot of this public health work. Okay. Then there's this Sender Yamalowski, And this is, I wanted to sort of put in a prominent um, business person. And this is like a real rags to riches cautionary tale. So in 1873, Sender opens a ship ticket business for immigrants to have their relatives come over. That was like a great business to be in. A lot of things are timing, as you know. I mean, if he opened that in 1924, I don't think he would get very much business. Sometimes it's really seeing what the market is doing and trying to be ahead of it and marketing it well. That's a lot of it. So he was good at that. And he did it and he made a lot of money from it. And he was the co-founder of Eldridge Street Synagogue, which we'll talk about later. And that was one of the most prominent synagogues. And it was like this wonderful place. And it was where these rich and poor people would pray together. It's still around and it's a museum now. It's beautiful. I've given like 5 talks there, I think. Now, he was called the East Side JP Morgan. And he was a man of many talents. He was also a rabbinic scholar, you know. So he was good at business, but he was also really good at scholarship. Well, his thing was that he wanted to open up a bank, and a bank that had it was about architecture uplifting society. This was a theme that was important in those days, how architecture can move the population. You know, McKim, Mead, and White are probably the best architectural firm that tried to enact this in so much of what they did, including Penn Station. And he wanted immigrants to feel comfortable going to the bank and giving their money. Please understand, there was no deposit insurance then. I mean, there were runs on banks. Like you could lose all your money. So they were kind of nervous about doing that. And he wanted them to feel comfortable. Well, he passes away shortly after its completion. Sadly, well, he bequeathes the business to his bank, to his sons. They totally mismanage the business. Like like they run it into the ground and they cause its demise. And guess what? In 1917, it's seized by the state. And I'm sorry to tell you that the depositors, many of whom were, these very hardworking immigrants who who toiled away in these very drudgery jobs. I mean, they really worked physically hard, like 6 days a week, like in dangerous conditions. Unfortunately, a lot of them lost all their money because there was no deposit insurance. See, this is why they came up with that years later. And the New York Times has an article about how they like basically ran after the sons of his who basically caused the bank to crash. And the sons like, jumped over a fence and got away, and it's this whole dramatic thing. Um, okay. So then Irving Berlin, I think we'll maybe do a talk on that. So I'm not gonna say too much on that now, and I want to get to a lot of other things. But let's just say that he was born Israel Baleen in rural Russia, in the Pale of Settlement, and he was a victim of pogroms. His family, his earliest memories that he talks about in interviews were his house burning down, and his father was a cantor and took his family to New York through Ellis Island. And they lived on the Lower East Side. And his father, as a cantor, probably inspired some of his love of music. And at age 14, he leaves home and he drops out of school and he becomes a busker. And that's someone who sings songs on the street for money and can sometimes sing show tunes to get interest for a show. So hired by a producer. And he self teaches the piano. He had like almost no education. So when you look at some of these Tin Pan Alley types, some of them, I'm not saying all of them, some of them had very little formal education. And, a lot of avenues were closed to people of color, to Jews, but they learned on their own. A lot of them had like natural talent. I also have to say, Irving Berlin was not the most scholarly person in the whole world. I mean, he was not a very good student. I don't think he was very interested in scholarship. Neither was his buddy Cole Porter, by the way, who went to Yale and Harvard. But what they don't say is he was not such a great student at Yale, and he did drop out of Harvard Law School. Anyway, he he was part of Tin Pan Alley, and I mentioned George on our call is the president of the executive director of the Tin Pan Alley Society. So next time you go to 28th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue, you'll see that that avenue is named Tin Pan Alley. That's the work of George and his organization, and it's going to be in travel apps and a lot of the preservation work that's done there. So I don't want you to think it was just on that street. No, it was all over the city and in Midtown and other places that music publishers were, but that's sort of like considered the one of the central points, if you like. Um, Another thing with Berlin is he kind of like borrowed from others a lot, if that's putting it nicely, from Scott Joplin, who invented ragtime. Berlin was, you really have to hand it to him. He was self-taught, and he became one of the most prolific songwriters in the country, in history. And he was really about writing simpler lyrics with simpler melodies. And he was more of a commercial artist. Um, he was good friends with Cole Porter, and he was sort of a mentor to Cole Porter. I personally have read many letters between the two of them, which are housed at Yale University Music Archives. Um, Cole was about sophisticated lyrics and a lot of cultural references that you sort of had to be in the know to understand. Cole was also about breaking the rules. Yeah, very much so in many ways. Berlin was not. He was more of a commercial artist. Um, but his music was very catchy. It was fun. And then he started, whereas he wrote more single songs, then he started to do more show tunes for Broadway and films in Hollywood, and like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers films and many others. And you see some of the songs here that he's very famous for that are known all over the world today. Okay.
White Christmas, which is not really a Jewish song related to Jewish religion. Did he ever write anything about Hanukkah?
Okay, good question. I'll answer that. No, he did not. And he wrote White Christmas. He wasn't that into Jewish culture. He wasn't, and or religion as an adult once he became like famous. He married a socialite, Mary, his second wife. His first wife died. His second wife was Mary Ellen, and she was a well-to-do socialite. And they really didn't have a Jewish like household at all. In fact, their favorite holiday was Christmas. And that was his thing. He wasn't into Jewish philanthropy. No. Um, I don't think he went to services. I mean, I can't say for sure, but I don't think he did. And White Christmas, he wrote that when he was in Beverly Hills, right, in LA, and he was missing home during Christmas because he was working on a show. White Christmas he wrote for Holiday Inn in 1944, which is a show as well as a film. It was actually on Broadway, by the way, about 5 years ago. It came back to Broadway. Um, and so he wrote White Christmas in 1944, not for the movie White Christmas, which also uses it a decade later. Um, yeah, he wasn't about all the Jewish stuff. Some of the other Tin Pan Alley people were a little bit more, but not him. You could say he was in some of his tunes and some of his he also changed his name, which they pretty much all did. I mean, he was Israel Baleen, George Gershwin did. Um, I would say most of the famous, Jewish ones did to make their names sound more marketable, like that. And that was just common also in Hollywood, whatever your name was, um, as well. Um, yeah. Okay. So let's switch gears. Now I just want to give you a sense of that. Let's go to travel places and food. So some of you, I know that you've been to some of these places. That's okay. It's okay that you've been to them. We can still talk about them, and you can learn some different things about them. So first, there's the Museum of Jewish Heritage. This is in downtown. It's tucked away on the majestic Hudson River. It has really beautiful views. This place really emphasizes the Holocaust more, and they have a lot of history across centuries. One kind of cool thing is it's the home of the Volksbühne Yiddish theater. So the Volksbühne is basically the only Yiddish theater from way back when that survives. It was nonprofit. Volksbühne means theater of the people. And they do a lot of shows nowadays, and in Yiddish. And then it has like the translation at your seat. Thank goodness, because I would be totally lost without it. And they have it in English and Russian, because some Russian attendees go too. And some of the actors and singers are excellent, and they learn Yiddish for the theater for these shows. And I asked some of them, I said, "Do you speak Yiddish?" "No, I don't. I just learned it for this." I was, it's like amazing. Now you have symbols like the gardens, boulders in the garden with saplings, and the six to represent the six-sided buildings, represent like the Jewish star and things like that. You also have a lot of documentary films and testimonies from Holocaust survivors and rescuers and soldiers. One of the things I'm doing in these talks now is mentioning a little bit about AI, because that's such a big topic. And there's sort of like really good things you can do with AI. I know there's a lot of bad things, but there are some good things. Let me talk about that for a minute. This museum, I think, is smartly using AI to generate content, but trying to make it as historically accurate as possible on like topics of the Holocaust and things like that, so that they can have it for future reference rather than just relying on actual footage. They're taking actual footage and taking different historical context, and they're trying to like create some supplementary content that can be used for answering certain questions or based on certain keywords. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, then there's the Center for Jewish History. This is a one-stop for Jewish collections around the world. I sort of say it's kind of like 5 museums, which you see listed here. Um, they have the handwritten New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. So you know how I mentioned that before? The actual I mean it's kind of neat. The original one is there. They also have a whole floor where you can trace your family history. And some of you might want to check that out. They can help you do that through genealogists. They have films and lectures, all these museums. There's a ton of different events. And it's if you go there, each one is relatively small. You can kind of see it all in a day and then see what you like, and then maybe go to some of the events or look at some of these in more depth. Um, Okay, and then the Jewish Museum is the third one in Manhattan, and this one is in the on the Upper East Side, housed in a mansion on Fifth Avenue that was owned by the Warburgs. Now, this is really about art with Jewish themes or maybe backgrounds, and besides the art, it also has artifacts and ritual objects from a lot of communities globally. Um, and it has like Hanukkah menorah temples from around the world. It's kind of interesting to see that and to see how different cultures and backgrounds imbue different aspects into ceremonial objects. Russ and Daughters, which we'll mention, like they had a little place at the museum. I don't know if that ever reopened, actually. So that's something to check out. The Tenement Museum, I think a lot of you know it, but if you don't, it's one of the best. I think it's one of the best museums. So it's a really interesting story about how it was founded that you can read about in the book. We won't have time to go through, but I'll just say that like it was founded by such unlikely circumstances. You never know when you're going to run into something. And like these two women that were trying to start a museum, the way they found it, because you have to find the right space to do this and the fateful way in which they did. I'll let you read about that in the book. All right. So this museum tells the story of immigrants from around the world to the Lower East Side. Um, and there's about 7 different tours, which are some are reenactments, some are different rooms, some are the German beer saloon in the basement. One's about the Irish, one's about the Chinese, Italian. There's about 4 or 5, and you see the actual tenements. Yes, they're refurbished, but they still try to make them as close to the original as possible. And they employ a lot of oral histories and objects to tell stories. They also have walking tours, food tours, the tenement talks events. And that's right on the Lower East Side, on Orchard and Delancey. in that area. They moved across the street, but it's been there since the mid 90s. And it's a very successful museum. It's really expanded a lot. Um, now, Sharif Israel is the oldest congregation, as we were talking about. And so when we mentioned um, about in 1654, you can call that a congregation. They have their first building in 1730. We talked about that on Mill Street. Then they have their second, then the Crosby Street, because they're moving uptown, which was very common by the mid 19th century. And then they make it to 19th Street as these areas start to develop, as they need to expand, as they also want to be where where the population is moving too. And they moved to their current location in 1897 on 70th and Central Park West. So this is Sephardic. And for those of you that don't know, that just means like of Spanish origin, as distinguished from Ashkenazi, which would be of German or Eastern European origin, as distinguished from Midrashi, or from like Armenia or Republic of Georgia, or Armenia or Azerbaijan, or as distinguished from Israeli, like Middle Eastern. So this one has its own rituals and its own objects that are applicable to a Sephardic tradition. So another name for this that you may see around is the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, and they own the Toro Synagogue, which I've been to. You can take a tour there in Newport, Rhode Island, in 1763. I think a lot of you know that well-to-do people and and in the Gilded Age would have a summer home in Newport, Rhode Island. And so that's also why it flourished during part of it. There's a show that mentions of this a little bit called The Gilded Age on HBO, which is excellent. It's just nominated for Emmys. So this place owns the Toro Synagogue. The Toro Synagogue is the oldest standing synagogue built in the US from 1763. Has it been in continuous use since then? No, it has not. No, it has not. So there were many decades where it wasn't in the 1800s. It's true. But even with that caveat, it still is the oldest standing synagogue. And you can go to services there too, by the way. It's a fledgling synagogue. It's not doing well. But if you ever get to Newport, I recommend a tour. Um, you can also do tours of the mansions that are there. There's 7 mansions, and they've all been preserved. And you'll learn about the Gilded Age and how these families would have like a summer home with like 100 servants or 200 servants, and they would be there for 6 weeks, and they would put on these parties. So that wasn't really so much a Jewish thing, but the synagogue was there, and you can kind of see both. Okay, so they were historical objects. Let's talk about some of them. That's what makes this place special. And you could see these objects in cases if you ever go there or ask to see them somehow or doing some kind of open house. So they are the pineapple rimanim, which is the Torah adornments during Passover in 1730. So you see the Torah adornments is the third one, right? The Hanukkah lamp from 1730. So for those of you that don't know, the Hanukkah lamp would be for Hanukkah, usually in the month of Kislev, in just December, kind of, and it's lighting the candles. And then the Revolutionary War scrolls that were desecrated by the British in 1776. So you see that here. But that's pretty amazing that it dates back to that. And then this here, the H48 S6, that's an Omer board. Okay, so what that is counting the days between Passover and Shavuos, which is another festival holiday, because you have to, part of the tradition is counting the days, and there's different prayers that you say on the different days and rituals. So that was like a counter, which I don't even know if they have anymore. They had in those days. Okay, so to mention some places, let's talk about the Jewish Rialto. Um, Second Avenue was a hotbed for Yiddish theater, um, especially during these 50 years. And in 1914, to give you some idea, this is before film, the first feature film, which was Birth of a Nation, right? Which was 1915. 1914, you had 22 Yiddish theaters and two Yiddish vaudeville houses. And you had the Yiddish Theater Stars Walk of Fame. So this is a really good tip. Um, if you go to 10th Street and 2nd Avenue, you'll see the stars, even now. And that was in front of what was 2nd Avenue Deli. And Molly Pecan and David Kessler are some of those. It's kind of like the Hollywood Walk of Fame, but for Yiddish stars. And then you can view some of the former Yiddish theaters, and you could sort of see what they were. So, for instance, there's a theater on 11th Street and 2nd Avenue, and so that's a movie theater now, and they show excellent movies, I might add. So that movie theater was a Yiddish theater, and if you go there, you'll kind of see how it really was built as a theater in terms of the layout of the stages, which are now screens, in terms of the way they did like the concession stand sort of. And you'll see some of the engraving on these buildings you can look for. Like that one was built around, it was 1925. And so in the book, I talk about all these kinds of things. So here's some different pictures. This is the Yiddish Walk of Fame. This the bottom is an example of a play. You have this movie theater I was talking about on 11th Street, and on the bottom right, you see some of the Hebrew lettering, and you see some of the architecture for when this was a Yiddish theater. Now it's still a theater. Now it plays like off-Broadway shows. Um, this was all part of the Jewish Rialto. There's a lot to say about this. You can actually read books just on Yiddish theater. I have a book on Yiddish theater, and you can learn about the different kinds of plays and how it sort of evolved over the 50 years. How some, we talk about Tin Pan Alley, right? And Tin Pan Alley. I mean, some of these performers were part of Yiddish theater, and some of them are what they call crossover, meaning they became more mainstream performers on Broadway or eventually in Hollywood, you know, when particularly when talkies came out in the late 20s. So let me mention now about some synagogues. So I'm just going to do a time check. I'm going to speak for maybe about 5 to 7 more minutes. I'll skip over a few things, but some of the places. I have a little video about Eldridge Street, which we don't have to do if we don't have time. But and then we'll open it up for some questions and comments. Okay. Um, Bialystoker Synagogue. This has a beautiful interior. I mean, it is absolutely gorgeous. Now, a lot of synagogues were churches. So in 1826, this was the Willett Street Methodist Episcopal Church, and it catered to a German population because this was Klein Deutschland. Well, a lot of the population started to move out of the area, and therefore it left a lot of churches needing buyers. And it was purchased in 1905 by the Bialystoker because they came from Bialystok, Russia, right? And they were congregants who met in two prior locations. And also, you have a possible. This is really something. On the balcony is like this sort of hidden door. They believe that this is from the Underground Railway, which was used to transport slaves and to hide them, where they would be on their way to Canada once they passed a law saying that they can recapture them even here. Um, and some other things. The synagogue was located on Hester Street, then Orchard Street, then to its current location. It was modeled after the inner sanctuary of Bialystoker in the Old World. It does not face Jerusalem like synagogues need to, so a mural of Western Wall to create the symbolic facing the east. It's Orthodox, so there's a women's balcony, but the balcony pre-existed it. And the Bialystoker was constructed in 1826, the actual building, so it's like 61 years older than the nearby Eldridge Street Synagogue, which frankly is more famous. and that was built in 1887. There's also astrological symbols on the ceiling, which you see, and there's a lot of symbolism behind that. Okay, so this is the museum at Eldridge Street. Let me just, do we have time to do the video? If that and a few other things would probably be about 5 more minutes.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's fine.
Yeah, so we're just going to eat into the Q&A or just go a little later. But the Museum of Eldridge Street, there's tons and tons we could say about it. For our purposes here, let's focus on this aspect. It was, built in the 18 it was built in 1887, and it was a magnificent synagogue that inspired everyone. Sender Yamalowski went there. A lot of poor Jews went there. They worshiped side by side. But then when a lot of Jews started leaving the area in the mid 20th century, it fell into disrepair. And then it would decline more and more. And you know what? It was all but abandoned. I think there were still services like in the basement. If I'm not mistaken, there was always services, but it was like really like, I mean, we're talking major disrepair. But then in the late 70s, it was discovered, and they decided to refurbish it in the late 80s and early 90s. And you know what? This is like won all kinds of architectural awards and preservation awards. And now well, I don't think the synagogue is thriving, but they have a museum at Eldridge Street. That's thriving. And that gets a lot of tourists. And it's a great place to you could take a whole tour of the museum. They do a lot of events. I've given like 5 talks there, like I mentioned. I've moderated a lot of panels there. So let's see about this video, just to learn a little bit about the preservation efforts.
When you came in here, there was this palpable sense of presence, of something. So the idea was, how do you preserve that character, that presence, that feeling about this place, which is so unique, so that when we replicated the new paint, we didn't want it to look brand new as if the place had just been done yesterday, but that it would have the same patina of age. So all of our in-painting, all of our reconstruction had to look as though it was as old as the building. See these little lines here? Those are pounce lines when they painted it originally. Here, this is all done with stenciling. These wire molds, this is the old electricity here. If you take these off, you'll find this exact same pattern and this pattern underneath there. In other areas, there was faux painting. You can see it on the pilaster here. This kind of naive marbleizing effect. And then the capitals were painted in metallic powder and gilded and glazed. And those are the basic techniques. That shows what it looked like. So it just in terms of how bad it was. All of these pendentas were completely overpainted with a solid color. We had to use a scalpel and shave off the layers of paint to get back to the image underneath it, the painted image underneath that.
Me, it's like treasure hunting, going to somewhere without anything but just my tools, and then when I scrape it and then have a design, it's like treasure, big supplies.
So we have to match not just colors but also technique. So like this brush strokes, the line which is not very accurate. So it's not because we can't paint perfect circle, because it was original was done like that. So we have to do that kind of,
Okay, so I just wanted to kind of give you that sense. I think I have to get out of here, but because it's you see how much artistry there was, and how much care went into this. So, okay, so now I'm going to skip over a few things for time. This is about the Greek temple. You can get the book and read about it, and it's a really interesting place and a whole story about Greek Jewry, okay, and who came from northwestern Greece. By the way, I went to the sister temple for this, which is in Athens, and it's funny, they all knew the people who run this place, and they tried to create a lot of the Greek Jewry here, and bought the building in 1927 and celebrates the Romanite history. No, it's not Sephardic. This is different. This is the Romanite history. And it's also where they have the Greek Jewish festival every year, which you can go to. Um, and there's like food and games and outside and tours of the building. And again, it was formed in 1906, so it really wasn't that long ago in northwestern Greece. And it's the only Greek Jewish temple dating to this period in the U.S. It's a really wonderful place to visit. You can take tours, you can go there. I've given some talks there. And we're gonna skip this because we just don't have time. So let me just do two things and then we're gonna wrap up. The Yonah Shimmel's Knish Bakery is a really wonderful place to visit. And so some folks don't know what a knish is, so I have that defined here. You can read that. The Knish Bakery, it's really like, I don't know, it's kind of like going back in time going into this place. That's what I love about it. It has a lot of Eastern European food, like in the back. And then it has the actual knishes of all kinds of flavors. It could be like blueberry and cheese. It could be more like chopped onion. And they do deliver far. And it's been around since 1910. So a Romanian rabbi for extra income had a push cart of knishes, and he eventually opened the store, came to its current location in 1910, right? And it's been on a lot of food shows, as you can imagine. The decor, it's been in a lot of movies. It was in a Woody Allen movie. Um, and then Russ and Daughters, um, I'll just say, rather quickly, that Joel Russ was the Polish immigrant. He was selling mushrooms and herring, like in his cart, just like the other one. And the goal and sort of moving up on the ladder, if you will, is opening your own store, which he did in 1914. And it was appetizing. It was an appetizing store. And in 1933, he made his three daughters partners, and so he renamed his store to Russ and Daughters. So that was very progressive to like have his daughters be business partners. He wasn't like that into all that stuff and progressivism. Don't be. That's not why he did it. He did it because it didn't have any sense. So it was sort of a practical thing. And those daughters have a lot to say about their experience. There's a book that was written that I have called The House Herring Built. And so the appetizers is like all kinds of smoked salmon, herrings, they have all kinds of candies, chocolates. And then I mentioned before about what does this mean as far as over the decades? How can you not only keep alive your business and the culture that it imbues, but how can you expand that and also recreate the customer experience accordingly? So, um, guess what? A decade ago, they opened Russ and Daughters Cafe, and that's also in the Lower East Side. That's open. It's open just for breakfast and lunch. I don't think it's open for dinner anymore. But that recreates the Russ and Daughters appetizing store, which is still open. And the cafe has similar food, but it's more like a meal. It has all kinds of herrings, all kinds of salmon, different kinds of like drinks and tonics. The decor of Russ and Daughters Cafe is that of the appetizing store. So they're like recreating that experience. And they also opened that in Brooklyn Yards, another place. They had it in the Jewish Museum. So that's something there. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this for time. I'm not going to talk about Carnegie Hall. There's a whole story there. I am going to wrap up and say that just a little about me. Here are my 7 books broken out by category. We've done 3 talks here. You can buy any of them or let me know or buy them online. This is my author site, paulkaplanauthor.com, and I have a lot of different material. It's a simple site. And so you get this or contact me for any books. And now let's open it up to Q&A. So Judy's going to facilitate that. Feel free to ask any question. Or again, it can be a succinct and relevant anecdote. Some of you, I'm sure, have been to these places and want to say something about it.
You can take your slides off the screen. We'll provide that information in the email that goes out on Friday. And this has been great. My great aunt by marriage, who came over in the 1880s, told a story of her parents coming over, and they took what little they had. They had, I think, some jewelry, some gold pots, some stuff like that. And when they got to New York and could see the shore, the father was so excited. He thought the streets were paved with gold. That's what they were told. And
Wow,
he
that's
threw
funny.
everything overboard because they weren't going to need it anymore. And they got divorced for good reason, I would say. So anyway, there are a lot of interesting stories that people had back then. So
Yeah, the one thing I just wanted to mention was that my father was in settlement house work, and I know there was a settlement house. There was a Lillian walled houses, which was I'm not exactly sure where it was. I'm not sure if it was in Brooklyn or Manhattan.
Paul
Um,
knows.
o- okay, and he actually the settlement house that he was diagonally across the main one was recreation rooms and settlement. And an interesting story about that is that I have a condolence letter which I found because I had to do some research, and the couple that went down on the Titanic, the um, who owned the
Macy's.
Yes.
You're talking about
Macy's,
Macy's, I
the
think.
Strauss family.
Yeah,
Well,
Macy's.
I have a copy of a letter the week the Titanic went down, a letter of condolence from the board of directors of the settlement house to the Strauss family and saying how grateful they were for the work that Mrs. Strauss had done. And it was on onion skin, but I was able to make a copy of it. It
And
was
what
in
was the
Okay.
settlement? What was the name of the settlement that your relative was in?
recreation rooms and settlement.
Okay.
Recreation rooms
Well,
and
the
settlement.
Lily when you the Lillian Walled houses are on like Avenue. They're in the Lower East Side in
Oh,
Manhattan,
okay.
like near Avenue D or something like that.
Well,
Mhm.
there were three settlement houses that my father was involved with, but unfortunately, he died at a very young age, and he had worked there when he went to law school, and he went back and he ran the settlement house only for a year or two because he died in his mid-40s, and
Very fortunate. I met a lot of the actors from the original Folks Bean Theater and
Wow.
the Jack Rec site, Seymour Rec site. I was very friendly with one couple, and I didn't realize that he was that famous person. He wrote the plays, and then we got to see the first nighters of all the plays, and that was fantastic. And then we went to the Village Gate, which at that time was open, and we had dinner there after the first nighters. So I was very lucky. I must have seen about 10 of them, and I could understand Yiddish at the time. And now I really don't understand it that well. I was with people who spoke it, and I was watching plays. So that was a wonderful time of my life. And the people who I knew are now gone, and the Folks Bean is not the same. It's a different theater, you know, different ideas. And my husband used to love Russ and Daughters. He went down to the original place almost every week because he loved the schmaltz herrings and things that you couldn't get anywhere else. So that was that.
That's
And
great.
let me just ask you as a follow-up, like with the Yiddish theater, what you mentioned some of the people you met, but like
Yeah.
what was your as an audience member in the Yiddish theater that you attended the plays? What was your experience like? What was the physical theater like?
Um,
Were you able to
okay,
understand everything?
many of
Yeah,
the
just give us a
directors
sentence or two about that.
were not Jewish.
Mhm.
Miriam, I don't think, who was married to Seymour Rex, Miriam Creston. She was a brilliant woman. She was not only an actress, but she wrote the plays and she wrote the songs, and they were our friends. And I saw them all the time, and I didn't realize how lucky I was at the time. And now I remember them, and it was a wonderful experience. And I remember a lot of the other actors whose names I don't remember, but I had seen them in English films, and they were so romantic and everything. And then when I saw them at the buffet, one of the actors' wives was picking soft foods for him, and I had a crush on him, and she said I have to pick soft foods because he has so much trouble with his teeth.
Yeah. Yeah.
A little
So
disillusionment.
romance. Trying to
Other
think what his name was.
questions or anecdotes or questions,
Sorry?
comments?
Yeah. No, this is about Yiddish, not about New York per se. I think there's been a revival of interest in Yiddish, and I had dinner recently with Sheva Zucker, who's taught at our school. She does Zoom classes teaching Yiddish all around the world. She's got students from any number of different countries. Most are Jewish. Who want to learn Yiddish. So it's interesting. I don't know if it's come back in New York, but there was a question.
Yeah, it has. So to answer your question, Judy, yeah, I mean, its own way. For example, the Yiddish, I'll give you some examples. So just the fact that the Folks Beanie has a theater, like they kind of didn't have a home, and they were at the CUNY Theater and all these places. Now they do, and I'll tell you what, they've had a few shows that have done really well at the box
Yeah.
office. Like really. No, but like it's not just like, oh, this is a nice cultural thing. No, like they actually turned a nice profit from some of it. So the interest is there because they had a few really well-reviewed shows. So that's one way. There's like a Yiddish like chorus that I've seen. Just some of the instructions, some interest in taking classes, and I know there's the Yiddish Book Center in Western Massachusetts that was revitalized a few decades ago. So while that's not New York, it's just, I'm sure it's connected here in various ways. So, I mean, those are three examples right there, Judy, to support what you're saying.
So let's go a minute over if we can. Thank you for that. Jewish politicians in New York, is there anything more you'd like to add about what role Jews have played, either in running for office, being in office, or being the power behind the throne? Paul, has Jews been important in New York politics as well?
Oh, who's you asking me?
Question for you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, certainly, like in terms of, just even if you look recently, like a lot of the leadership has been, Jewish in comparison to the population. I mean, you have to look at things to the comparison of the population of the city of New York of 8 million people. So you have, some of the mayors and some of the like the House, the Speaker of the House, Sheldon Silver of the New York State Assembly was Jewish, although he got in trouble for corruption and went to jail, but he was. And then looking at Elliot Spitzer and the Attorney General, and the governor. So some certainly didn't last in their jobs for various reasons, but I would say played an outsized role in the New York State Assembly and Senate, and also as far as being state senators and assemblymen, and in the city council, and a little bit in some of the mayoral. Let's say in the last 50 years, for argument's sake, you have Abraham Beam and Ed Koch, as two examples in the 70s and 80s, respectively. So I would say in terms of both city, local, and state, of course, we all know U.S. senators like Chuck Schumer is the senior senator of the Senate. We're all familiar with him, and he's, but very, very influential. So on the national level like that as well, and also Bloomberg. So I mean, if we look at just a lot of the mayors, Beam, Koch, and Bloomberg, who served 12 years, and Koch 12 years, it's like a high percentage of the overall years.
Springer, etc. Okay, well, thank you. This has been wonderful as always, and really, really enjoyed it. So can we all please thank Paul, and we'll have information about his books in our email. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thanks. Great to be here with you.
Okay, look forward to having you.
Yeah, enjoy the book. Go to these places, check them out, discover it. Bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye now.